Well, Taylor Swift is in her London era, the pop superstar kicking off her European Eras tour tonight at Wembley Stadium. And Swifties are more than ready for the show. But just how prepared is the UK economy? TD Bank says that Swiftonomics may even impact Bank of England rate cuts. And joining us now is the man behind the research. His name is James Rossiter. He is TD Head of Global Macro Strategy and Chief European Macro Strategist. And I am so excited for this conversation. Let's start off with, how do you go about thinking about quantifying the impact that this concert tour might have when it comes to the European economy?
Yeah, I mean, look, we start with inflation, I guess. For us, that's what really matters. It's something we put a lot of effort into, forecasting that. And we collect a lot of hotel prices as part of that process. And we were looking through the data about a week ago and started noticing some spikes and looked into those spikes and started noticing some overlap with some Taylor Swift tour dates. And you know, it's not a new story. We've seen it reported a little bit before, but we had some raw data to turn to, and we could see it very clear. So we figured, why not just write something about it and put it out there.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, people making a destination out of her tour locations, of course, flying from other parts of the world. And like you said, this isn't a new story. Of course, she's been on tour for years, it feels like. And with that in mind, I mean, how much of a blueprint did you have when it comes to some of her previous locations, and especially when you think about the U.S. Eras tour?
Well, you've definitely seen it reported in the media, right? And I think the places you tend to see the biggest impact are the cities that, you know, effectively are smaller cities because they can't handle the added pressure or quite as easily of a tour of, you know, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of fans converging on a city. And, you know, you've seen it in some smaller states for sure. When we were looking at it over in Europe, you know, in Sweden, in April, we saw increased pressure on the travel services industry. That's hotels, airplanes, restaurants, that sort of thing around her dates there. We had the Eurovision finals around the same time. And then in the UK, you know, cities like Edinburgh, cities like Liverpool, they're mid-tier cities. You get that many fans converging at the same time. The hotel capacity just isn't there to take on everybody at sort of competitive prices. They raise the prices a little bit. We see it in inflation.
And let's talk about this in comparison to some of those other events that you ran through. Of course, you mentioned Eurovision, for example. We have the Olympics coming up in France. Where does the Eras Tour rank when you think about some of those?
It's a good question. I think because it is so short and intense, you know, we're going to see those impacts for a very few days, and that's it, and then it disappears. Something like the Euros, for example, in Germany right now, or the Olympics in Paris, we're going to see a bit more spread out. You know, and from a technical point of view, I mean, the statistical agencies gathering this inflation data only pick and choose 1 or 2 days a month to do that. And there is a chance they just miss the Eras Tour entirely. If they're picking, you know, a different day than Taylor Swift's in town, they might not see that inflation. Somewhere like in Germany or in Paris with the Olympics and the Euros, you may get a bigger impact because there's going to be that more sustained pressure over a bigger number of days. People are making even bigger holidays out of it. And it's going to make the inflation data really noisy, really hard to interpret over the next few months across a lot of Europe, I think.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. And like you said, short and intense, that is the Eras Tour. Let's put some numbers to that. The New York Times reporting that about 700,000 people are expected to see the shows when it comes to London. You think about the timing here, how noisy it could make the inflation data. What does that mean potentially for the Bank of England?
So look, I think at the end of the day, central bankers, you know, want to be in a position where they can look through this data and understand what's driving it, what's temporary, what's persistent. They've got their eyes on inflation really 1.5 to 2 years down the road. A few concert dates in the summer of 2024 in London are probably not going to affect inflation that far down the road. What really challenges them, though, is that it's just going to make the data really noisy and really hard to see. You know, we already had been flagging in the UK data, there had been signs of intense pressures in discretionary services. That's the same sort of stuff that Taylor Swift fans are going to be spending money on. So, you know, the Bank of England may have noticed that a few months ago, and then suddenly you get a surge from the tour dates. Well, what's true underlying demand here, and what's just a temporary blip that's going to go away? It's going to make reading that data for, you know, for the Bank of England, for the ECB, even for the Riksbank to some degree, a lot harder. And to some extent, they're probably going to want to wait to see what the following month holds, just to make sure that things cool off a little bit. And what they saw was temporary and not signs of kind of stronger underlying demand.
Well, it's an interesting question, right? Can you extrapolate anything about the state of consumer spending from what we're seeing when it comes to just the demand that we've seen so far for the Eras Tour? Because clearly, I mean, looking at some of these figures, these expected figures, it seems like this is a consumer that's still willing to spend on these types of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got inflation coming down, wages still fairly strong. Real incomes are rising now, right? People are feeling better off. What I think is kind of playing against that backdrop, though, and this is what we really have to be watching for over the next few months, is we've seen some warnings from some big travel firms that the revenge spending we saw last year, which was really, really intense, is starting to come off a little bit. So those extra holidays people took a year ago, maybe not so much this year. Maybe it's because they're spending all their money at Taylor Swift. I don't know. But, we've got to kind of keep the bigger picture in mind. And if that revenge spending's kind of unwinding at the same time, it could be that the Taylor Swift thing is just, a very narrow, sharp thing. And actually we see kind of trending downward in the broader services sector over the course of the summer. Again, there are early signs of that, but I think for now it's just going to be noisy and difficult to parse a lot of this data.
Well, it's interesting, of course, on this program, we talk about the U.S. consumer all the time. So give us a few more details on the state, of course, of the European and the British consumer, because in the U.S., the story has been for several years now that sentiment is pretty miserable by most surveys, but still the consumer just keeps on spending. The American consumer is resilient. Does that story carry over to the rest of the world?
And not so much. I mean, America really does stand out. When I look across sort of the cover, the G10, the countries we cover, the American consumer is very, very strong. There are some underlying signs here and there of weakness, but it is a different animal to, say, a European consumer. Now, I contrast that a little bit. We got great data out of the UK this morning. The retail sales data shot up way, way more than anyone expected, completely unwinding the previous month's weak number. So to some degree, there's signs of some life in the consumer. And as I said earlier, the fact that wages are still growing by more than inflation, and inflation has come down from double digits in Europe down, we're getting towards target. We're at target in the UK even. That means real wage growth is there, and maybe we're at a turning point. We're actually quite optimistic on kind of the European, the UK, the Eurozone economies for the course of this year, because we think a lot of the big negatives that we've seen over the last few years from higher energy prices and all that, those have kind of worked their way through the economy. And as those disappear, it's generally a good news story from here.
And James, before I let you go, I have to ask, are you going to the Taylor Swift concert?
I think my little girl would wish we were going, but unfortunately, no, we're not.
All right. Well, maybe next time she comes to Europe. James, really appreciate your time on this Friday. That, of course, is James Rossiter. He is TD, Head of Global Macro Strategy.